All right, fine, you beautiful humans. We did end up going on a field trip, and I actually used the Insta360 One X2 outside of my own backyard and the studio. And I mean, really, all of this is my backyard. All of this footage is what I would consider my backyard. And of course, we do tend to shy away from unboxings and initial impressions. I don't really do that. If you know me, we test. And although Insta360 did send me the 360 One X2, and it was a while ago, the only expectation was that I get to say what I want and test it how I want. And I certainly did. And I've had it a while, and this thing has been through it. I mean, I literally beat this thing up. And even though we did take some hits along the way, which I will be sure to share that bit of information, those details with you later. However, I think the question that you might have to ask yourself is not whether you all of a sudden have to take up a new sport to make this a valid purchase, but rather more along the lines of how this might help you emphasize where you are, like the environment, if this is the type of angle that helps move that story along or even help you pivot to the next scene. And as much as I like the versatility of a mirrorless camera with interchangeable lenses, I do find myself often using my iPhone, like especially for shots like this. Because if I'm filming for a client, that might be a little bit different, but like on the move, having a 360-degree option feels even more specialized. And it also doesn't take up that much space in a pocket or a small bag, like when you're particularly needing to be mobile. And when you're thinking about the field of view there, like, of course, there are times where that wide establishing shot, like you get that wide establishing shot that eventually you punch in on the subject or an environment. And yes, with other action cams, you can get that wider field of view. And I know that the fisheye look, it's not for everyone. I get it, but this feels a little bit different. Rather than the image feeling like bent or distorted, having that 360 point of view offers that feeling of more like being wrapped in the environment. And I mean, hopefully that makes sense. I'm trying to just bring you into that. So, I mean, take it for like however you will. And I do want to talk about the limitations here, but as far as the tech, this is a 5.7K resolution, but for full context, this resolution is spread out over the entirety of these lenses, which of course it may feel stretched. But as someone who primarily films and uploads in 4K, and then wanting that 360-degree perspective for these shots, I'll take any extra resolution that I can get, because this is where, like in post, like in my edits, this is where I want to push things around. But this is also where the expectation has to shift with the capability of that sensor, and also where you see that the software in the Insta360 is trying to do as much of that lifting. And if I were in a constant like tiny planet mode, which is kind of cool, but I know that this is where every pixel is really getting used. However, for the look that I might be going for, and especially if this is something I'm using for, say, social, like Instagram, I could scale this down to 1080 with like still getting very nice shots. And if I'm uploading to YouTube, even if I'm starting in a 1080p timeline, I can still scale this up in 4K in my export, because, you know, there is that YouTube compression and I get it. And it's also still very much action cam-esque. But for many of you, at least according to my analytics, you're watching these on your mobile device anyway. And I do at least want to touch on some of the aspects of the editing, which there is one really cool feature that I had no idea about until I got in there, and I immediately fell in love with it. However, you will find yourself in the Insta360 Studio app to really get things dialed in. And I'll like touch on that because we need to. But going back to those linear shots, they're still fantastic for a smartphone, but being able to take the selfie stick, which it just magically disappears out of the frame. And you just put this thing up in the air to grab those additional, like just to get that immersive coverage, like all of that coverage of the environment or the subject. And it's definitely helpful if you find yourself that you need to keep your eyes forward rather than just focused on whether you're getting the shot or not. And of course, speaking of shots, I did take a few to the chin, and this isn't the fault of the selfie stick. This is just user error on my part, because I've apparently decided that I only have one speed, and this is just something else for me to manage, especially as you get toward the end of the day and you're getting more tired. So the helmet mount is where I found it to be the most useful as far as the shots like that I was looking for in particular, and keeping me more balanced as I kind of worked my way through some of those tight spots that I tend to find myself gravitating toward, because I really do like to tease out my inner Sonic Hedgehog here. But that additional perspective can really invoke that feeling of being there, like you're pulled into the landscape. And of course, depending on what you're filming, there's also that element that you feel as if you can just like reach out and touch or feel certain aspects of the surroundings. And of course, even feeling uncomfortably closed in on some of those shots, as it might seem in that particular perspective. And some of those shots actually were like, I was in some very tight areas. But during those bright and sunny and like days, like in those environments, that can really impact that shot or add some artifact in there. Like if you are in the edit and you're kind of finding some like lens flare and you're trying to figure out how to clean this up, just like say that one of the angles, like your primary angle, it's really blown out and there's this lens flare or something happening. And so initially, like you might have to pass on the footage, but in your final edit, or at least in the editor, this is a camera that gives you that angle that you have the option to look at other perspectives of that shot that might still be able to tell that story maybe in a different way without completely losing that footage. But the edit, this is actually where the Studio app that I mentioned earlier, which you can download from Insta360's website, this is where you're going to bring that footage in. And even though I was able to export that footage to Final Cut without any kind of issues, I got it transcoded in the Studio app, which you do have the option to scale up or down, and you can export it in H.264, very heavy. The M1 Max was no problem, but there's a lot happening there. But you can also do H.265 and of course ProRes 422, although that ProRes footage will be a much larger file, like 3, 4, maybe even 5 times the size. And even though you can bring this in as a 360-degree project mode in Final Cut, it's pretty straightforward. Then you can manipulate the orientation, but the biggest issue will be your keyframing those different angles depending on what you're looking for. And not to mention the footage, like for me, it just didn't look how I wanted it to. And I really found myself pivoting back to the Studio app. This is where I could easily get the angles, and like rather than having to like manually mess with the orientation, like the X and Y axis, I could just keyframe the footage in the Studio app how I wanted it, so that, you know, once it was all done, then I could just bring it in for grading for a specific look that I was going for. And the Studio app, I think, requires a dedicated video in and of itself. And I can link up a creator that has a great walkthrough. I might actually follow back up with that, but at least to kind of give you some context. But speaking of that walkthrough, let me share this like really killer feature that is so much fun to play around with. All right, so we're in the iPhone. You turn the Insta360 on and we are connecting in the app. Okay, so you're in the app here and you get the footage. It's on the SD card, but you're also syncing it up here with the phone. So let's actually find a section here to show you kind of what I'm talking about. Okay, so in this snap functionality, which I'm in the perfect chair for, just not the perfect mic. I should have had the overhead mic. So what you can actually do, and you're like, yeah, I know, you can move the phone around and it'll, you know, do its thing. But here's the thing. Let's say, so I'm recording here, and let's say that I want to focus in on my son. So I can just keep moving around. I'm like refilming, or I'm like editing the footage. Whoops, I'm losing my place because I'm trying to talk to you. But as you can see, I can just focus on him. So instead of like focusing ahead, it's like I can just hold the phone and just follow him. And then if I wanted to just move around under my microphone and then go in this direction, I can do that as well. And then of course, you know, stop that. And then boom, here's what I have. I have this filmed, or, you know, it was already filmed, and I just recorded this with you right here. Now, of course, I would have done a better job if I wasn't trying to talk and do this at the same time, but you kind of get the idea. That is a really cool feature. Now, that battery life is definitely going to be better than that of the GoPro, at least based on my experience, at least my GoPro. And it, of course, it is very subjective in like wherever you're filming. So myself being in a cold environment and filming off and on for 2 full days, like after like having it fully charged, I returned back to the condo on that second day and had about 20% left on the battery. And again, this is based on several short bursts that like would go from as little as like 30 seconds to up to like several minutes, like many, as we were like kind of making full runs down the mountain. But pivoting back to the like mounting the camera, I mentioned the helmet mount, which this is actually, you know, what I would prefer. But unlike the 360 One RS that has that lower profile, this is actually where the One X2, like I was able to feel this on my helmet. Like you can kind of feel a little bit of the drag, but for the most part, it didn't really influence my ride, except that I did have an issue with some of that movement. So if you're doing anything with jumps, there is a specific setup that you can use to kind of have this like across the helmet and down. But I just went through like with the standard mount here, and when I was like moving off of a jump, like I was moving off this jump and so did the camera. Like I literally pulled the whole thing off. So there's definitely a combination of physics involved as well as possibly just something with the adhesive. But I don't think that this is anything with the Insta360. That's not their issue, but likely some user error on my part. I'm willing to accept responsibility. But the biggest thing that I really wanted to highlight is that it got knocked pretty good. I mean, yes, it was on the snow, but there weren't really any issues with the camera, although I do recommend covering with the lens cover, and just to really kind of keep that intact as far as the lenses and keeping those clean and try to keeping them scratch free. But I was able to continue filming throughout the entirety of the trip for the rest of the week. But as far as this being a relevant piece of gear in your bag, I would say that yes, there is definitely a little extra work involved, especially in your post-production. But if you're someone that really likes this type of footage, you start to work with it more and more in post, and then you start developing that muscle memory, and then that starts to kick in. And therefore, I really do think that it can offer some value, especially for those of you that are on the move in a scenario where you just need to keep your eyes forward. And of course, this really does lead me to this story. And I wanted to save this story for dessert, and it's more like dessert pizza, which those two do not, they do not go together. So maybe that's why we're talking about this. And speaking of this helmet, yes, this is an Angry Birds helmet. So I actually broke my helmet, not on this trip, but we had some extra helmets laying around, and apparently this was a much larger size, and it fit my head. We just all have big heads in the family. So, but here, let me get this out of the way. The disclaimer here is that we assumed all the risk here. This has nothing to do with Insta360. We were taking this trip anyway. It was just two of my kids because my oldest was on another trip. So, and all my kids are teenagers, and they have been on skis or snowboards since they were like 3 years old. It was very important for me to get them into that sport, especially being from Colorado. But here's the thing. If at any time the words escape your mouth, whether it's the end of the day or you're feeling a little tired and you say, how about one more run? If that ever escapes your mouth, your lips, it might not end the way that you would hoped. So as we were getting up to the lift and we were saying, you know, instead of doing lunch now, let's just take one more run. And we were kind of getting kind of pumped and I don't know, excited or whatever. And as I said earlier, I have one speed. And as much as I try to keep up with my kids try to keep up with me. And so I got my bindings on, boom, and I bombed down this hill. We had taken this hill several times. They're very familiar with this mountain. They grew up on this mountain. They're both familiar, and you typically keep the less experienced riders in front of you. That's just the deal. Unless like tree runs, I always like scout out the runs, so I do keep them behind me. But it was like one of those things like where I blasted by them and then I look back and of course I still see them like kind of in the rear view, and I am going fast, stop, and I'm waiting and I see my middle son, you know, he's there, boom, we're waiting for our youngest. And we're like, all right, what's the deal? Like we don't see him and I didn't see anything happen. So we're like, all right, well, we're not far from the lift. So we'll just meet him down at the bottom at the lift, because again, we had been taking these runs most of our trip and even the trip before. So as I get down to the bottom, didn't see him, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, he might have taken another run or done something, like went through the trees and did something where like it's going to take him longer to get down here. And of course, then the parenting thing, you're like, oh, we didn't hear anything. And then all of a sudden the phone rings. I'm like, oh, he's telling us like basically, or he's saying like, hey, I ended up on a run. I'm on another lift or whatever. And I can hear he's pretty distraught, you know? And then I'm like, oh crap. So he said, something's really wrong. And I'm like, okay, what happened? Of course, he's intact. You know, like the clinician kind of kicks in. He was able to call me. We're immediately getting on the lift. We don't even have to wait in the lift line because it was like not a busy day. So we're immediately on the lift. I'm talking to him. I'm like, so what happened? And he's like, I fell. And he's like, I'm not sure, but I can't move my shoulder. And I'm like, oh, great. So as we're going up the lift, I see him in the distance and he's talking to me. And again, like we're connecting, no issues. He wears a helmet. He didn't hit his head, he said, but he said he fell on his shoulder. He fell forward. I guess he hit a bump. And it was just one of those things like where you hit a bump, physics, you land on your shoulder and boom. So as we get to the top, of course, ski patrol's off to the right. They have like a little cabin there. I pop in real quick. It's like, I think we might need some assistance with my son, and I'm down. So his brother went to go check him out. And as soon as I get to him, you know, he's again, very upset. And I just kind of feel around the shoulder. And as soon as I like rub my hand or my fingers across the clavicle, I was like, yep, there it is. Bones heal, my friends. Brains, not so much. Wear those helmets. But he was so disappointed because he was like, we were here having this fun trip. We should have taken lunch, you know, all of the things like I should have done this. I could have done that. And of course, as a father, I'm like, I could have, you know, I feel terrible. But let me just say that all was well. He got to ride the sled down. We followed ski patrol down. They have an emergency room there, like right at the base of the mountain, and we got him dialed in. And typically if the clavicle is uncomplicated, especially like for kids, like if they're in this, like if they're in the vicinity, they'll eventually meet up. And so by the time of this video, he's already since been out of the sling and he'll be back in soccer in no time. But yeah, it's, that was a hard one for me. Anyway, that's the story. Just wanted to give you some context. So if you're still here, don't be shy in those comments. You go out there and rock those faces, and I will catch you right back here on the next one. And wear those helmets, protect that nugget, and don't try to keep up with me. Just go at your own pace.